The wind cut through my thermal gear like a knife made of ice. Even with every layer that I owned wrapped around me, the cold found its way to seep into my bones, reminding me that this was a place where humans weren't meant to survive. My breath came out in puffs that froze before they could dissipate, and my goggles were constantly fogging despite the anti-fog coating. My name is Dr. Miles Petrov, and I'm a research assistant, or was before everything went to hell. I was part of a joint expedition between the University of Colorado and the Norwegian Antarctic Research Institute, set to study the effects of climate change on previously unexplored regions of the continent. And what we found instead was something that made the climate the least of our worries. Our base camp, designated Station EO, was a collection of prefabricated modules connected by insulated walkways, positioned on a relatively stable ice shelf about 200 miles from the nearest permanent research station. Our team consisted of 8 researchers and some support staff. Myself, Larson, our expedition leader and glaciologist, Kenji, our atmospheric physicist, Okafor, the marine biologist, Toby, the communication specialist, Ingrid, the camp coordinator, Nathan, our mechanic and just general handyman, and Kari, the geologist. We had been at Station EO for 3 weeks when the first signs appeared that we weren't alone out here. It started with equipment malfunctions, small things at first. Nathan found that several of our snowmobiles had their fuel lines cut, clean slices that couldn't have been caused by wear, tear, or the cold. Ingrid saw that our food supplies were being systematically depleted, with entire cases of rations going missing overnight, despite the storage room being locked up. Larson dismissed these incidents as human error or the effects of the extreme cold on our equipment and supplies. But then Dr. Kari found the tracks. It was during our 4th week at the station. Kari had gone out to collect samples from an exposed rock formation about 3 kilometers northeast of our base. She had taken the usual precautions, an emergency beacon, a satellite phone, and enough supplies for a full day in the field. When she returned that evening, her face was pale beneath her protective gear, and her hands shook as she uploaded her photographic evidence to our shared database. "These aren't animal tracks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as we gathered around her laptop in the common area. "And they're definitely not human." The photograph showed impressions in the snow that were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were roughly humanoid in shape but enormous, easily twice the size of a human footprint. What made them truly unsettling wasn't just their size, but their depth and the fact that they seemed to show clawed digits, 5 on each foot, with the claws extending several inches beyond what would be normal toes. "Could be a polar bear," Nathan suggested, though his voice lacked any conviction. "Maybe the prints got distorted by the wind or some melting." "Polar bears don't live in Antarctica," Okafor pointed out, "and these prints are too regular, too deliberate." "There's something else," Kari said, clicking to the next set of photos. "These tracks lead in a straight line for over 1 kilometer, directly toward our base. They stop about 50 meters from our perimeter." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Whatever had made those tracks had been watching us. Larson cleared his throat. "We need to be more careful about our perimeter security. I want motion sensors set up around the camp, and nobody goes out alone anymore. A buddy system always." "Should we report this to the main station?" Toby asked. "Let them know that we might have a problem." "And tell them what?" Larson replied. "That we found some unusual tracks in the snow. They'll think that we're suffering from cabin fever or altitude sickness." "No, we handle this internally for now. Document everything, but let's not create a panic." It was the wrong decision, though none of us knew it at the time. The attacks began 3 days later. I was working late in the lab module, analyzing ice core samples under the microscope, when the lights went out. The sudden darkness was complete and disorienting. There are no streetlights or ambient light sources in Antarctica. The only illumination comes from your equipment and the occasional aurora. And tonight the sky was overcast. The emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, bathing everything in a red glow that made the lab look like a scene from a horror movie. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door, intending to check the generator in the main module. That's when I heard the screaming. It was coming from outside, somewhere between the lab and the sleeping quarters. A human voice, but distorted by terror and pain, rising and falling in pitch like an animal caught in a trap. The sound sent ice water through my veins and made my skin crawl. I fumbled for my radio. "This is Miles in the lab. Does anybody copy? What's happening out there?" Static answered me, and then Toby's voice, strained and breathless. "Something's out there. Something big. It took Ingrid." I grabbed my emergency kit and headed for the door, but before I could reach it, the screaming had stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. "Toby, where are you?" I called into the radio. "In the communications module," came his shaky reply. "Don't go outside. Whatever you do, just don't go outside." I looked through the lab's small window, wiping away the frost that had formed in the inside of the glass. The area between the modules was empty, covered in pristine snow that reflected the emergency lighting. But there, leading away from the camp and into the darkness beyond, was a trail of deep impressions in the snow. Those same footprints that we had seen before, but now they were accompanied by something else. A parallel groove, as if something had been dragged alongside the creature. Something or someone. I keyed the radio again. "Toby, I can see tracks leading away from the camp. It looks like something had dragged Ingrid away." "Miles, listen to me." Toby's voice was urgent. "I've been trying to reach the main station, but all our communications are down. Not just the satellite uplink, but everything. Radio, internet, even the emergency beacon. It's like something jammed all of our frequencies." A chill ran down my spine. That's not possible. The beacon operates on a completely different frequency than our communications. "Well, I know, but I'm telling you, everything's dead. We're completely cut off." I began to understand the true horror of our situation. We were alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest help, with something stalking us in the darkness. Something that had already taken one of our team members. "Where is everyone else?" I asked. "Larson and Nathan are in the main module, trying to get the generator back online. Kenji is in his quarters. Kari and Okafor are in the geology lab. Nobody's seen Ingrid since the power went out." I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to rendezvous with the others, I decided to stay put and wait for dawn. The lab had its own backup power system, independent of the main generator, and it was the most isolated of our modules. If something was hunting us, it would probably check the more central areas first. I barricaded the door with a lab bench and settled in to wait, keeping my radio close and my flashlight ready. Every few minutes I would check in with the others, but as the night wore on, the responses became fewer and more sporadic. Around 2 in the morning, Kenji's voice came through the radio, barely a whisper. "It's outside my window. God, it's looking at me." That was the last that I heard from him. Closer to 4, Nathan screamed over the radio channel, a sound so full of terror that it made me drop my flashlight. The scream cut off abruptly, and when I tried to ring him, there was no response. And by dawn, I was the only one left responding to radio calls. When the sun finally rose, a pale cold disk that provided little warmth but blessed visibility, I emerged from the lab to find Station EO in ruins. The main module's door had been torn completely off its hinges, the metal twisted and mangled as if it had been ripped apart by something with incredible strength. Inside, furniture was flipped, equipment destroyed, and the walls covered in deep gouges that looked like claw marks. But there were no bodies, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened to my colleagues except for the trails in the snow leading away from the camp in different directions. I spent the morning searching the rest of camp, hoping against hope that I would find someone alive, someone who had managed to hide or escape. What I found instead was more of the same. More evidence that whatever had attacked us was both intelligent and very methodical. In the communications hub, I found Toby's equipment smashed beyond repair, but tucked under his desk, I discovered a handwritten note. "Miles, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. The thing that's hunting us isn't natural. It's too smart. It caught our communications first and then picked us off one by one. I think that it's been watching us for weeks and learning our routines. Check the emergency cache in the supply module. There's a backup satellite phone there. Try to reach the main station. Whatever you do, don't go out alone after dark." The emergency cache contained the backup satellite phone, but when I tried to use it, I got nothing but static. Either the device was damaged or something was still jamming our communications. I was alone, cut off from help, and something was hunting me. That's when I remembered Kari's survey equipment. She had been using a GPS mapping system to chart unexplored areas around our base camp. If I could see her data, I might be able to find the other research stations or emergency shelters in the area. I found her field notes and GPS unit in the geology lab. According to her findings, there was an abandoned research station about 15 kilometers to the northwest, designated on her maps as Station Primo. It had been established in the 1980s but abandoned for unknown reasons. It might have supplies, working communications equipment, or at the very least, a more defensible position than our compromised base camp. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. I packed food, water, supplies, and warm clothing. I also took Nathan's rifle, a heavy caliber weapon that he had brought for just-in-case situations. At the time I thought it was overkill, but now I was grateful for his paranoia. As the evening approached, I made my decision. I couldn't stay at Station EO. It was compromised, and whatever had taken my colleagues would almost certainly return. I had to try to make it to Station Primo, even if it meant traveling through the cold night. I set out just before sunset, following the GPS coordinates that were marked. The first few kilometers were relatively easy, traveling over packed snow and ice with good visibility. But as darkness fell, the temperature plummeted and the wind picked up, creating a whiteout condition that made navigation nearly impossible. I was forced to shelter in my emergency tent for several hours, waiting for the storm to pass. It was during this time, huddled in my sleeping bag with only a chemical heat pack for warmth, that I first heard the sounds. They started as a low rumble, almost below the threshold of hearing. At first I thought it was just the wind, but gradually I realized it was something else. Something moving through the snow around my tent, circling me at a distance. Whatever it was large enough to make the ground vibrate with its footsteps. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as these sounds continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes they would stop, and I would hope that the creature had moved on, only to hear them resume from a different direction. It was playing with me, I realized, stalking me, learning my scent, my patterns, and my weaknesses. Eventually the sounds faded away and I managed to get a few hours of fitful sleep. When I woke, dawn was breaking and I was eager to get moving again. But when I emerged from my tent, I found that the creature had left a message. Arranged in the snow around my campsite were pieces of equipment from Station EO. Toby's radio, Kari's hammer, Nathan's toolbox, and there, placed carefully on top of my snowmobile, was Ingrid's ID badge, covered in what looked like dried blood. The message was clear. I know who you are, I know where you came from, and I'm coming for you." I packed up camp and continued on with my journey, pushing my snowmobile as hard as I dared across the treacherous terrain. The GPS showed that I was still about 8 kilometers away when I saw in the distance a cluster of dark buildings against the white landscape, half buried in snow but clearly artificial. As I approached, I could see that Station Primo was much larger than Station EO. It consisted of at least a dozen buildings connected by covered walkways, with what appeared to be a central command structure and several outlying facilities. Most of the buildings were partially buried in snow, suggesting that they had been abandoned for many years. I parked my snowmobile near what appeared to be the main entrance and approached on foot. The door was sealed but not locked. I was able to force it open with some effort. Inside the station was dark and cold but structurally intact. Emergency lighting flickered on as I entered, powered by some kind of backup system that was still functioning after all these years. The first thing I noticed was that the station was much more sophisticated than our research base. This wasn't a temporary field station. It was a permanent installation, built to house a large team for extended periods. The main corridor was wide enough to drive a vehicle through, and the walls were lined with doors leading to laboratories, living quarters, and storage facilities. The second thing that I noticed was that the station wasn't entirely empty. I had been exploring for about an hour, checking rooms and looking for anything useful when I found the first body. It was in one of the laboratories, seated at a desk as if the person had simply fallen asleep while working. The body was perfectly preserved by the cold, still wearing a Soviet-era research uniform with a name tag that read, Dr. Volkov. The sight of the body wasn't what shocked me. It was the fact that the laboratory was still active. Equipment was humming quietly, computer screens were showing data, and there were recent notations on a whiteboard that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Somebody was still here, still working. I continued through the station more cautiously now, checking each room before entering. I found more bodies, all Soviet researchers from the 1980s, all perfectly preserved, all positioned as if they had died while going about their normal duties. But I also found evidence of recent activity. Fresh coffee in the break room, newspapers from only a few weeks ago, and a maintenance log showing regular entries up until 3 days before. In the central command room, I found what I was looking for, a working communications array. But when I tried to use it, I discovered that all outgoing transmissions were being blocked. The equipment was functioning perfectly, but something was preventing any signals from leaving the station. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from deeper in the station, in the direction of the laboratories that I hadn't yet explored. Heavy, deliberate footsteps accompanied by the squeak of equipment being moved. Somebody was definitely here and they were working on something. I took out the rifle and checked the ammunition. 5 rounds. Not much, but better than nothing. I followed the sound of the footsteps, moving as quietly as possible through the corridors. The sounds led me to a section of the station that appeared to be heavily modified. The walls were covered in additional insulation, and there were warning signs in Russian that I couldn't read but recognized as hazard warnings. The lighting here was different too. Harsh white that made everything look clinical and sterile. I reached a door marked with a biohazard symbol and what appeared to be a laboratory designation. Through the small window I could see movement inside, somebody in a full hazmat suit working on a series of lab benches. I knocked on the door. The movement inside stopped immediately. After a moment, the figure in the hazmat suit turned toward the door. Even through the protective gear, I could see that they were gesturing for me to enter. I opened the door and stepped inside. "Dr. Petrov, I presume," the voice said, Russian, and came from a speaker system built into the hazmat suit. "We've been expecting you." "Who are you?" I asked, keeping the rifle ready but not directly threatening. "How do you know my name?" The figure reached up and began to remove the hazmat helmet. Underneath was a man who appeared to be in his 60s, with gray hair and pale eyes. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. "I am Dr. Victor Petrov," he said, and my blood ran cold. "I believe I'm your grandfather." I stared at the man claiming to be my grandfather, my mind racing. My grandfather Victor had died when I was a child, or at least that's what my family had always told me. He had been a Soviet researcher who had disappeared here in Antarctica in the 1980s, presumed to be dead. The family had grieved and they moved on. But here he was standing in front of me, apparently alive and well after more than 30 years. "No, that's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke, I could see the family resemblance. The pale eyes, the same stubborn jawline that I had inherited from my father. "Many things are impossible, yet they happen nonetheless. Please, lower your weapon. We have much to discuss in very little time." I didn't lower the rifle, but I didn't aim it directly at him either. "You're supposed to be dead. My family held a memorial service." "Unnecessary fiction," Victor said, moving to one of the lab tables. "My work here was too important to abandon, too dangerous to acknowledge. Your government and mine agreed that it was best if I simply disappeared." "What kind of work?" I asked, looking around. It was clearly a research facility with strange equipment that I didn't recognize, and specimens in various stages of preservation. Victor gestured to a series of photographs pinned to a bulletin board. They showed different tissue cultures and what appeared to be anatomical drawings of some kind of creature. "We are studying the indigenous life forms of Antarctica, life forms that predate human civilization by millions of years." I looked more closely at the photographs and felt my stomach lurch. They weren't like any animal that I had ever seen. The bone structures were massive and the muscle tissue incredibly dense. The neural networks far more complex than anything in the animal kingdom. "You're studying the creature that attacked my team." "Creatures," Victor corrected. "There are several of them, possibly a small breeding population. We've been observing them for decades, trying to understand their biology." "And you just let them hunt us. You could have warned us." Victor's expression was grim. "Warning you would have meant revealing our existence, and our work here is too important to risk exposure. Besides, you and your colleagues were, how do you say, convenient test subjects." I raised the rifle again, fury coursing through me. "You used us as bait." "Not bait, subjects. We needed to observe how the creatures interact with modern humans, how they hunt and how they adapt to new threats. Your presence here provided us with invaluable data." "My colleagues are dead." "Yes, and their sacrifice has advanced our understanding considerably. Now let me show you what we've learned." He led me deeper into the laboratory past rows of specimens and preservative fluid and banks of computer equipment. At the far end of the room was a large observation window looking into what appeared to be a holding cell. Inside the cell was one of these creatures. It was even more terrifying up close than I had imagined. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, it had a roughly humanoid shape, but with proportions that were utterly alien. Its arms were disproportionately long, ending in hands with 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, each digit tipped with claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. Its legs were powerful, like a wolf's, ending in feet with 5 clawed toes. The head was the most disturbing part, vaguely human in shape with a pronounced snout filled with sharp teeth, and eyes that held an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. The creature was pacing back and forth in its cell, occasionally stopping to stare directly at us through the observation window. When it did, I could see that its eyes were not just intelligent. They were calculating, evaluating, and planning. "We call them the originals," Victor said. We believe they're the first inhabitants of this continent, predating the Ice Age by millions of years. They survived the climate changes by adapting, by becoming something more than animal but less than human. How many of them are there? I asked, unable to look away from the creature. We've identified at least 6 individuals in this region, possibly more. They appear to have a complex social structure, with individuals taking on different roles within their group. Some are hunters, some are scouts, some appear to be leaders. And they're intelligent. Extremely. They've learned to use tools to plan coordinated attacks, to adapt their hunting strategies based on their prey. The one that attacked your base camp had been observing you for weeks. I felt sick. And you watched this happen. We documented it, every moment, and now we know more. This knowledge will be invaluable when they begin to expand their territory. Expand their territory? What do you mean? Victor turned to me, his expression grave. The ice is melting, Miles. New areas are opening up in Antarctica that have been frozen for millions of years. And the originals are already adapting, already expanding their range. In another decade, they'll begin to spread to other continents. No way. They couldn't survive outside of Antarctica. Couldn't they? Victor gestured to a map on the wall showing global temperature changes. The northern reaches of Canada, Siberia, Alaska. These are becoming more like Antarctica every year. The originals are perfectly adapted to these conditions. They're also intelligent enough to learn and to adapt further. I stared at the map. You're saying that these things could spread across the world. It's not a question of could. It's a question of when. And that's why our work here is so important. We need to understand them before they become a global threat. Or we could just eliminate them, kill them before they can spread. No, impossible. They're too smart. Military force would only make them more dangerous. No, the only way to deal with them is to understand them completely. To learn how to coexist. Coexist? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These things killed my friends. Yes, because your friends were in their territory, threatening their survival. But if we can communicate with them, if we can reach some kind of understanding. You're insane. Victor's expression hardened. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts and not emotions. The fact is that the originals are here, they're smart, and they're not going away. We can either learn to live with them or we can face extinction ourselves. I was about to respond when an alarm began to sound throughout the laboratory. Red lights flashed and a computerized voice began speaking in Russian. Victor's face went pale. They found us, he said. What? The originals. They've located the station. We're under attack. As if to confirm his words, I heard the sound of metal being torn apart, coming from somewhere in the direction of the main entrance. The creature in the holding cell had stopped pacing and was now standing at the observation window, its head tilted as if listening to something. How many of them? I asked, checking my rifle again. All of them. They've come for their captured packmate. The sounds of destruction were getting closer. I could hear the creatures moving through the station, searching every room. It was only a matter of time before they found us. Is there another way out? Victor nodded toward a door at the far end of the laboratory. Emergency exit. It leads to a tunnel system that connects to several outlying buildings, but they'll be watching for that too. Well, then we need a distraction, I said, looking at the creature in the holding cell. What happens if we release it? Are you mad? It would kill us both. Maybe it would distract the others long enough for us to get out of here. Either way, we're dead if we stay. Victor considered this for a moment and then nodded reluctantly. There's a manual release switch for the holding cell. but once it's activated, we'll have perhaps 30 seconds before the creature breaks free. And then we'd better be ready to run. I positioned myself at the emergency exit while Victor moved to the control panel for the holding cell. The sounds of the approaching creatures were very close now. I could hear them in the corridor just outside of the laboratory. "On 3, I whispered. 1, 2, 3. Victor hit the release switch and the door to the holding cell began to slowly rise open. The creature inside immediately sensed the change and moved toward the opening. We ran. The exit led to a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. I could hear the creature behind us, now free and undoubtedly confused by our presence and the scent of its packmates elsewhere in the station. We ran as hard as we could through the tunnel, my flashlight bouncing wildly as we navigated the twists and turns. Behind us, I heard the sound of the creatures finding each other, their low rumbling calls echoing through the tunnels. They would be after us soon, but for now they seemed to be focused on their reunited packmate. The tunnel led to another building smaller than the main station but still substantial. Victor led me through it quickly, gathering supplies, food, water, cold weather gear, and most importantly, a different set of weapons. "This is an old Soviet military base," he explained as he handed me a more modern rifle. "We maintained it just in case." "How long have you been planning for this?" I asked. "Since the first day we discovered the originals. We always knew that eventually they would find us, that we would have to abandon it. The question was whether we could complete our research before that happened." "And did you?" Victor pulled out a small data storage device. "Everything we've learned about them is on here. If we can get this information to the outside world, we might be able to prevent a global catastrophe." "What are their weaknesses?" "They're vulnerable to certain frequencies of sound. Ultrasonic waves disrupt their neural patterns. They're also susceptible to a specific chemical compound found in certain plants. And most importantly, if you can eliminate the alpha of the pack, the others become disoriented and vulnerable." "How do you identify the alpha?" "Well, size primarily. The alpha is always the largest and most aggressive. It also has distinctive markings, scars and patterns that indicate its status." We reached the exit of the building and Victor paused to check the outside through a small window. "Clear, but they'll be tracking us. We need to reach the comms array in the outer station." "I thought that all communications were jammed." "Not all of them. There's a hardwired system that connects to a satellite array. It's our only chance to get this info out." We left the building and began to make our way across the open ground toward a smaller structure about 200 meters away. The snow was deep here and it was tough sledding. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of the creatures searching the station that we had just left. We were halfway to the comms building when the first of the originals appeared behind us. It was massive, even larger than the one that I had seen in the holding cell. This had to be the Alpha that Victor had mentioned. It stood on its hind legs, scanning the area with its intelligent eyes, and when it spotted us, it let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. "Run!" Victor shouted, and we sprinted the remaining distance to the comms building. The Alpha gave chase, moving with surprising speed across the snow. Its packmates emerged from the station behind it, at least 4 more of them, all converging on our position. We reached the building just as the Alpha caught up to us. Victor fumbled with the door lock while I turned to face the creature, raising my rifle. The Alpha was even more terrifying up close than I had imagined. Its eyes held not just intelligence but something approaching wisdom, an ancient knowledge that came from millions of years of survival. It studied me for a moment, tilting its head as if trying to understand what I was exactly. And then it attacked. I fired 3 shots center mass and the bullets found their mark, but the creature barely seemed to notice. It kept coming, closing the distance between us in seconds. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my protective gear and drawing blood. "Miles!" Victor shouted. "The door!" I rolled away from the Alpha and dove through the doorway that Victor had finally managed to open. He slammed it shut behind us just as the creature's claws scraped against the metal. "That won't hold them for long," Victor said, moving to a bank of communications equipment. "I need maybe 5 minutes to establish a connection and transmit the data." I could hear the creatures outside testing the door of the walls, looking for a way in. The Alpha was directing the others, its rumbling calls coordinating their efforts. "They're going to break through," I said, reloading my rifle. "Well, then we need to make sure they don't reach the communications array," Victor replied, working frantically at the controls. The building shook as the creatures threw themselves against the walls. I could see claws penetrating the metal sheeting, slowly tearing it apart. "How long?" I asked. 3 minutes, maybe 4. "I don't think we have 3 minutes." The wall to my left buckled inward and I could see the Alpha's massive form silhouetted against the opening. It was trying to tear its way through the metal with its bare claws, and it was succeeding. I fired several shots through the gap, but the creature was too smart to expose itself fully. It continued to work at the wall, gradually enlarging the opening. 2 minutes, Victor called out. And that's when I remembered the chemical compound that Victor had mentioned, the one that was toxic to the originals. I looked around the building and spotted what I was looking for, a fire suppression system. If I could activate it, the chemical suppressant might be enough to drive them back. I found the manual activation switch and pulled it. Immediately, the building filled with a dense white foam, and I heard the creatures outside recoil with roars of pain and anger. 1 minute, Victor said. The foam seemed to be working. The Alpha had stopped trying to break through the wall and was backing away from the building. But I could see that the other creatures were circling, looking for another way inside. I got it. Data transmitting now. How long? 30 seconds. The creatures had found another way in through the roof. I could hear them tearing at the metal sheeting above us, and pieces of debris were starting to fall. 20. A section of the roof gave way and one of the creatures dropped through the opening. It was smaller than the Alpha but still massive, and it was clearly disoriented by the chemical foam. I emptied my rifle into it, and this time the bullet seemed to have more effect. The creature stumbled and fell, but it wasn't dead. 10 seconds. The Alpha had overcome its aversion to the chemical foam and was forcing its way through the wall opening. Its eyes were focused on Victor, who was still working at the console. 5 seconds. 5 seconds. I threw myself between the Alpha and Victor, drawing my sidearm, a pistol with only 6 rounds. The creature was on top of us when Victor had shouted, "Done. Completed." The Alpha reached out with one massive clawed hand and I fired every round I had into its face. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't stop. Its claws caught me across the chest again and I felt myself being lifted off the ground. And that's when the building exploded. I woke up in a medical facility surrounded by white walls. For a moment I thought that I was back at the laboratory at Station Primo, but then I noticed the modern equipment in the view through my window. Not a snowy wasteland, but a city skyline. "You're awake," a voice said. I turned to see a man in a doctor's coat standing beside my bed. He was middle-aged with kind eyes and a concerned look. "How are you feeling?" "Where am I?" I asked. "Morrison Station Medical Facility," he replied. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. You have severe hypothermia, multiple lacerations, and a concussion. But you're alive." "Victor, my grandfather." The doctor's expression grew somber. "I'm sorry. There was only one survivor found at the explosion site. The rescue team found you buried under debris about 50 meters from what remained of that building." I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of grief and relief. Victor had sacrificed himself to ensure the data transmission had been completed. At least his decades of research wouldn't be lost. The explosion, though, what caused it? We're not sure. The rescue team found evidence of some kind of chemical reaction, possibly involving the building's fire suppression system. The entire communications array was destroyed. But the transmission, did it get through? The doctor looked puzzled. What transmission? There's no record of any communications from that facility. The site had been abandoned for decades. My heart sank. Had it been lost in the explosion? I need to speak to whoever's in charge of the rescue operation, I said, trying to sit up. There are things that you need to know about what happened out there. Well, that would be Colonel Sarah Matthews. She's been waiting to debrief you. But first, you need rest. You've been through severe trauma. No, this can't wait. People need to know what's out there. The doctor reluctantly agreed to contact Colonel Matthews, and within an hour, I found myself in a secure briefing room with several military and civilian officials. Colonel Matthews was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that suggested she had seen more than her share of classified briefings. Dr. Petrov, she began, we need to understand exactly what happened out there at Station Primo. Your original research team was found dead at Station EO, and you were discovered alone at an explosion site that shouldn't have had any active personnel. We need answers. I told them everything. The attacks on our team, the discovery of Station Primo, my grandfather's research, the creatures that we called the Originals. I described their intelligence, their hunting patterns, and their potential threat to global security. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room. Colonel Matthew traded glances with the other officials before speaking. Dr. Petrov, you've been through an extremely traumatic experience. Hypothermia and head injuries can cause vivid hallucinations, even false memories. I'm not hallucinating. Everything that I've told you is true. There are creatures out there that pose a serious threat to everyone. We need to do something about it. Even if we believed your account, one of these civilian officials said, we found no evidence of any creatures at either station. No tracks, no DNA, no bodies. Yeah, because they're smarter than us, I explained. They know how to cover their tracks and how to avoid being found. That's what makes them so dangerous. Colonel Matthews leaned forward. Dr. Petrov, I'm going to be direct with you. We have satellite imagery of both stations from the past month. There's no evidence of any large life forms in that area. Your colleague's body shows signs of exposure and equipment failure, not animal attacks. I stared at her, shocked. No, that's impossible. I saw the claw marks and the tracks in the snow. What you saw were the effects of extreme cold on metal and ice formations that can look like tracks to somebody under stress. Your grandfather Victor Petrov died in 1987. Station Primo was abandoned the same year after a chemical accident had killed the entire research team. No, I spoke with him, he showed me everything. The creatures were in the holding cells. There were no holding cells at Station Primo. The station was a geological research facility and nothing more. When our team looked at the explosion site, they found evidence of you attempting to operate communications equipment that had been non-functional for decades. I felt like the world was tilting beneath me. But the data transmission, Victor said that he sent the information about the creatures. There was no transmission, Dr. Petrov. The equipment hasn't worked in forever. They were wrong, they had to be. But as I sat there looking at their faces, doubt began to creep into my mind. Had I really seen what I thought I had seen? Could my grandfather really have been alive after all these years? I need to go back. I need to see the site again. That's not possible. The area has been declared off-limits due to structural instability. Besides, you're in no condition to return to the field. Well, then send a team. Do a proper investigation. Look for those creatures for any evidence of what my grandfather found. Dr. Petrov, the colonel said, her voice becoming more firm. There will be no further investigation. This incident is being classified as an equipment failure resulting in the tragic loss of 7 researchers. You're the sole survivor of a terrible accident and nothing more. You're covering this up, I realized. You know something. Colonel Matthews stood up, ending the briefing. You'll be transported back to the United States for further medical evaluation and psychological treatment. I suggest you focus on recovering from your ordeal rather than pursuing fantasies about monsters in the ice. As I was escorted back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. But what? And why? 3 weeks later, I was back in Colorado, officially on medical leave from the university. The official report listed the incident as equipment failure due to extreme weather conditions. My colleagues at Station EO had died from exposure after their heating systems had failed. I had suffered severe hypothermia and head trauma, leading to hallucinations and false memories. The story was neat, tidy, and completely wrong. I tried to continue my research to find evidence that would support my account of what had happened. I reached out to other researchers looking for similar reports of unusual encounters or unexplained disappearances. What I found was a pattern of stories that had been suppressed, witnesses who had been discredited, and evidence that had mysteriously disappeared. But I also found something else. A package waiting for me at my apartment with no return address and no postmark. Inside was a data storage device and a handwritten note. Miles, if you're reading this, then my transmission was successful after all. The data on this device contains everything we learned about the originals. Use it wisely. They're still out there and they are spreading. The ice is melting and they are adapting. Someone needs to be ready when they make their move. Trust no one in authority. They know more than they're admitting. V. I plugged the device into my computer with trembling hands. It was all there. Decades of research. And most importantly, a detailed map showing the original's territories across Antarctica and migration patterns that extended far beyond the continent. According to Victor's data, the creatures weren't just in Antarctica. They had already established footholds in northern Canada, Siberia, and even Alaska. Smaller populations but growing, and they were learning and getting used to the new environments. There was also something else in the data, a set of rules that Victor had developed for surviving encounters with the originals. 1. Never travel alone in their territory. They are pack hunters and will isolate single targets. 2. Maintain constant communication with your team. They will attempt to cut off your comms before attacking. 3. Avoid metallic sounds and bright lights after dark. These attract their attention and mark you as prey. 4. If you encounter one, do not run unless you have a clear escape route. They're faster than humans and running triggers their chase instinct. 5. If attacked, target the eyes and throat. These are their only vulnerable areas that conventional weapons can penetrate. At the bottom of the rules was a final warning. The originals are not mindless beasts. They are very intelligent and utterly ruthless. They've survived millions of years for a reason. I stared at the data for hours on end, trying to process everything that it held. If Victor was right and they were already spreading outside of Antarctica, then humanity was facing a threat unlike anything in recorded history. And the authorities either didn't know, didn't believe, or were actively suppressing the information. I made a choice that would change my life forever. I couldn't trust the official channels, I couldn't rely on the government or the military to take action. Somebody had to warn people. Somebody had to prepare for what was coming. I began to work on a plan to return to Antarctica to gather more evidence and to document the creatures and their capabilities. It would be dangerous and probably fatal, but it was the only way to prove the truth. 6 months after my return from Antarctica, I received another package. This one contained a single item, a photograph taken by a trail camera in northern Ontario. The image showed a creature emerging from the tree line, clearly one of the originals, but smaller than the ones that I had encountered. It was looking like it was hunting, stalking something outside of the camera's view. The photograph was dated just 3 days earlier. They had made it to North America. I tried to contact the authorities, but it seemed that my messages and calls were being monitored and blocked, and I was told that they were unavailable. It became clear that there was an active effort to suppress information about the originals. But why were they doing this? The answer came in the form of an encrypted message from an anonymous source. They've been tracking the creatures for decades. Project ARC, military black ops. They're not trying to stop them, they're trying to weaponize them. The creatures are too smart to control, but they're trying anyway. They see them as the ultimate biological weapon. You need to get out. They know what you're doing and they're coming for you. I didn't have time to verify the message. That same night, I was awoken by the sound of vehicles outside my apartment. I looked out the window and saw black SUVs parked on the street, men in dark suits standing beside them. I grabbed all of my research, Victor's data, and what few belongings that I could carry, and I made it out through the fire escape. By the time that the agents broke down my door, I was already 3 blocks away. I went underground, literally and figuratively. I found shelter in a network of researchers and other whistleblowers that I had cultivated through my time looking into this. People who understood the importance of what we were facing and the danger of government suppression. At this point, I didn't have many other options, so I decided to go public with all of my findings. I created anonymous accounts and began sharing Victor's work, my own experiences, and the growing body of evidence that I had found. I posted the photographs, some of the biological data, and most importantly, the rules for survival. Not soon after, I received a message through one of my accounts. Dr. Petrov, we know who you are and what you've been through. We need your help. The situation is much worse than you know. The creatures aren't just expanding their territory, they're preparing for something. We have evidence of coordinated behavior across multiple continents, as if they're building towards some kind of global event. We're working on a response, but we need people with your knowledge and experience. Are you willing to help out? The meeting point is attached. Come alone and trust no one else. The meeting point was a location in northern Canada, close to where the trail camera had photographed the creature months earlier. It was obviously a trap either by the government or by someone worse, but it was also my only chance to make a real difference, to be a part of an actual response to the threat. I made my decision. I would go to the meeting even if it killed me. The journey to northern Canada took 3 days of careful travel, using false IDs and avoiding any major transportation hubs. When I finally reached the coordinates, I found a small research station in the middle of the wilderness, the kind of facility that could be easily overlooked by satellite surveillance. Inside, I met the people that sent the message. It was a mixture of scientists, military personnel, and intelligence operatives from multiple countries, all united by their knowledge of the original's threat and their frustration with official inaction. Their leader was Colonel Morrison, a former U.S. Special Forces officer who had encountered the creatures during a classified operation in Alaska. His team had been hunting for what they thought was a terrorist cell, only to discover that the real threat was something far older and more dangerous. And Dr. Petrov, Morrison said as I had entered the briefing room, We've been following your work. Your grandfather's research has been invaluable to our understanding of these creatures. What exactly are you planning to do about them? I asked. Straightforward enough. Locate their breeding sites and command centers. Use coordinated strikes against these locations and hope to disrupt their expansion and force them back into the polar regions. I like it. Let's not waste any time. When do we start? I asked. The first mission was scheduled for 2 weeks later, targeting what satellite imagery suggested was a major originals gathering point in northern Alaska. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly dangerous in execution. A small team would infiltrate the area, deploy a sonic disruption device, and retreat before the creatures could mount any sort of response. The insertion team consisted of 5 people, myself and Morrison included. We flew into Alaska under false identities and then traveled overland using snowmobiles and other cold weather survival gear. The target site was a valley about 70 kilometers from the nearest human settlement, identified by satellite imagery as showing unusual thermal signatures and what appeared to be a large-scale construction activity. We believed it was either a major breeding site or a command center, where the creatures were planning their next phase of expansion. As we approached the valley, the first thing that I noticed was the silence. In most wilderness areas, there is always some sort of sound. Bird, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. But here there was nothing. Even the wind couldn't be heard. They know we're here, Morrison whispered. Stay alert. We crested a ridge overlooking the valley and saw something that we couldn't believe. The entire floor of the valley had been modified, transformed into a massive communal space. The most disturbing were the originals themselves. There were dozens of them, possibly over 100, gathered in the center of the valley in what appeared to be some kind of organized assembly. We positioned the sonic disruption equipment on the ridge overlooking the valley, with clear sight lines to the creatures below. The device was about the size of a briefcase and looked innocuous enough, but it would generate infrasonic pulses powerful enough to disrupt original communication across a radius of several kilometers. And once we activate this, they'll know that something's wrong. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before they adapt or overcome the effects. Well, then we'd better make these 10 minutes count, Morrison replied, checking his weapons one final time. We activated the device and immediately we could see the effect on the creatures below. They were confused and disoriented, moving erratically, some falling to the ground and clutching at their heads. It's working. But our celebration was premature. Even as the majority of the creatures were affected by the sonic disruption, a few of the larger ones seemed to be adapting it. They began to move with purpose again, organizing the other confused creatures and directing them toward our position on the ridge. They're adapting faster than we had expected. We need to go now. We began to withdraw, but it was too late. The originals had already located us and they were moving up the ridge toward us at lightning speed. Even though they were disoriented and confused, they were still incredibly dangerous. The device, we can't leave it. Forget about it, we need to. But Morrison's words were cut off as the first of the creatures reached our position. It was one of the larger ones and it moved with the deadly grace that I remembered from my encounters in Antarctica. One of the lieutenants opened fire, targeting the creature's eyes and throat. The bullets found their mark and the creature stumbled, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that seemed to cut through the sonic disruption, rallying the other creatures to its position. Move, 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 Morrison shouted and we began a fighting retreat down the backside of the ridge. But we were badly outnumbered. For every creature that we disabled or drove back, 2 more took its place. They were learning to work around the effects of the sonic disruption, adapting their tactics in real time. One of our sergeants was the first to fall. She had positioned herself to cover our retreat when 3 of the creatures had flanked her. Even with her weapon and training, she couldn't handle 3 of them at once. Her screams echoed across the valley as they overwhelmed her. "No!" Morrison called out, starting to turn back toward her position. "She's gone," I shouted, grabbing his arm. "We can't do anything for her now." We continued to retreat, but the creatures were gaining on us. And by the time that we had reached our snowmobiles, only Morrison, myself, and one of the doctors remained. The creatures had stopped pursuing us, apparently content to have driven us away from their home base, but we knew that it was only a temporary reprieve. As we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had witnessed something that would change everything. The originals were not just trying to expand their territory, they were preparing for a war, and humanity was losing. It's been 6 months since our attempted rendezvous at their base and since the expansion began. The official casualty count is in the hundreds of thousands, but the real number is probably much higher. Entire regions of northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia have been declared uninhabitable. The governments continue to claim that the attacks are the result of terrorism or natural disasters, but fewer and fewer people believe the official stories. At this point, I'm not overly optimistic, and I think that it might be too late. Those in charge have let this go on for far too long, and I think that it's now out of their control. Right now, our best hope is to relocate to warmer regions in the hope that it'll hold the originals off from expanding even further. We haven't given up, but we're grasping at straws right now. If anybody has any advice, please let me know. We need all the help that we can get. Rain, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Cashier, Talamagara, Degi, Leon Knott, Jimmy Griffin, Miss Eldridge, Sleepy Shroomy, Takio Zarilla, Richard French, Mina Lynn Kidder, Mark Norman, Andrew Harrington, Swaggity Swoot, Omni Rubik, Sonic GMD, Lunas TV, Rolly, Wayward Son, Caleb Windsor, Never Enough, Russell and Flo, Stevie B7649, Ray Weingartner, Stephen King 04, Shrimpo the Shrimp, Genevieve Sweet.